This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm joined today by Come Carpentier Gourdon. He's, of course, in many ways a living bridge between India and France. He spent his whole lifetime analyzing politics in India, in France, and really working as a bridge between the two countries. He's best placed to explain what I want to discuss today. A very important speech by President Macron of France, talking about the future of Europe. Come, welcome.
Greetings. Hello, Hindol. Nice to see you, and thanks for the kind introduction.
Your initial comments when you heard President Macron talk about if Europe does not boost military capabilities, the future is doomed. And Europe should not, will not, he said, remain as, in a sense, a vassal state of the United States. Your first comments when you heard that?
First, it was a rather long speech. It was given on the occasion of the 7th anniversary of a speech he had given in the same place at the auditorium of the Sorbonne, very historic location in Paris, soon after his inauguration. Now he's 2 years into his second term, and he's perhaps at the lowest point in terms of popularity. He's one of the three most unpopular Western leaders, with approval rating well below 30%, and in fact closer to 20. And he therefore is trying to project an image of modernity, ambition, and resolve. How that will go is to be seen. I don't think that speech will change the overwhelming opinion in France and in Europe that Macron would like to be a leader of Europe, but that he is in fact too weak at home and also not powerful enough to bring about the changes that he likes to evoke. Now, with regard to the statement he made, you have to put it in the context. He talked not only about military coordination and sort of union at the European scale, but also of economic and political union. In a way, he is reflecting the views that have been expressed not too long ago by Mario Draghi, who used to be the president of the European Central Bank and who is now rumored to be the successor of Ursula von der Leyen as president of the European Commission. And what Draghi said in the United States back in March is that Europe would just not survive economically and politically unless it was transformed into an actual state. In other words, the ambition of Europeists for over 100 years some Europeists, is that Europe should not remain simply a sort of a political economic confederation, if you want to call it that way, but it should become an actual state. And therefore, the implication is that the member states should become, I wouldn't say provinces, but more like the states of the United States of America. And of course, that's a very, very hard thing to sell in Europe because there are 27 states, as many languages, and very strong traditions of independence, which are not easily renounced. Therefore, when the French president speaks about a European federation, which would in fact become a state, most people in smaller countries feel that it would be a sort of a condominium of France and Germany, and possibly led by Germany more than France. And therefore, there is considerable skepticism. Now, the military implication is also very, very controversial, because that would essentially mean stepping out of NATO, because NATO indisputably gives precedence and practical hegemony to the United States. Therefore, the idea of pulling away from NATO and creating an autonomous and sovereign independent defense force, European defense force, is not accepted by many countries, beginning with Germany, which is very comfortable with the US nuclear umbrella and military presence. And of course, Britain. Britain is not in the EU, but Macron actually mentioned the United Kingdom as a very close and natural ally. And as we all know, Britain is closely coordinated with the United States in matters of defense and will not really trade that with a membership of a European Defense Union, which is at this point very, very I would say, hypothetical. So again, by saying that, Macron is setting himself in a way against US traditional policies. But on the other hand, he is also, of course, invoking the threat of Russia very clearly, and even the threat of China and Iran and some other states as anti-democratic states which are threatening Europe. And by making this kind of black and white, sort of dichotomy between democratic, civilized Europe and many other parts of the world, he's antagonizing a number of real or potential rivals. And he's also making the United States quite doubtful about where Europe wants to go. Now, the immediate objection that comes to mind is, what if Trump wins and decides he wants very little to do with European defense, which he seems to be inclined to do? Then would Europe be in an easier position to create its own autonomous defense with nuclear umbrella provided presumably by France and to an extent by Britain? That is all hypothetical. And frankly, I don't think even Trump would want to sever the links of the United States with NATO, simply because it is too embedded in American fundamental policy. And NATO is required to keep Europe tied to the US. And I don't think any American government would like to actually break up these 80 years old links with the continent, because for them, it's an essential defense against the Eurasian potential challengers.
You touched upon many things that I wanted to discuss, and I want to take them one by one. You mentioned Trump. That was obviously the next question. If Trump wins, later in the year, many questions will arise once again about the United States' commitment to NATO. Now, you, of course, just said that actually in the immediate term, at the very least, the United States is too embedded historically, structurally, to NATO and the idea of NATO. But talk to us a little bit about how the winds of change are, in a sense, sweeping through all these solid old assumptions. If Russia finally wins, or at the very least, if Russia is not comprehensively defeated in the Ukraine war, then it raises many more question marks. And in some senses, many of the fears that Macron seemed to be expressing in his speech will begin to form in many minds, isn't it?
You see, at this point, most rational and impartial military analysts and political analysts agree that Russia cannot be defeated in Ukraine. In fact, the New York Times has recently published an article explaining that Ukraine will be a smaller country and that it may be stronger for it because you will no longer have this very sharp division between the Russian East and the Central European West. So assuming that Ukraine does indeed, or rather has to agree to the permanent loss of the Donbass and Crimea, then the question remains, will Ukraine be a buffer state, which is obviously what Russia wants, or will it be integrated into EU and NATO, which is what both the US and the European Union seem to be insisting on. This will have to be decided in the coming months or years. The question, however, is that a European Union that tries to be sovereign, as he put it, and again, there is a very controversial issue here. How can a union of so-called independent states be sovereign? And does that mean that its member states are no longer sovereign? In fact, this is the current situation, where sovereignty of national states in the European Union is highly limited. And as a result, even Macron said that, we have to perhaps think of abolishing the rule of unanimity and having qualified majority, which effectively would mean smaller states, or at least some states which happen to be in a minority on a particular decision, are simply overruled. And no state will easily accept that, especially given the diversity of cultures, but also geographic, historic, economic diversity. So I would assume that this whole idea remains rather hypothetical, because what Macron is doing is setting Europe against not only Russia and potentially China, because he made several references to, sort of totalitarian states where there is no democracy and people entrust their lives to a government. But he's also essentially establishing a distance, and even in opposition to the United States, he made a number of critiques of the US policies and system, which, for example, with regard to the internet, in his mind, allows far too much freedom and does not guarantee protection of individual rights, does not fight sufficiently against hate speech, and all those things that in Europe are the subject of a big debate. But then again, Macron, as usual, is rather ambiguous and contradictory, because on the one hand, he was talking about freedom and humanism, but on the other, he was apparently suggesting that there should be a lot more control and restrictions as to who can use the internet and how, which in turn says who is the regulator, So that in itself gives the impression that he's advocating for some kind of more, if I would say, socialistic control of the net by the states or by a specialized government entity. Anyway, these are all details of his vision, of his worldview. But with regard to, let's assume that Trump comes to power and that he tells European states, you have to raise your military budgets. Otherwise, I'm really not going to help you if you get into further trouble. And of course, in a way, that's what the European states have in principle accepted. Some of them have already raised their budgets to 2%. And the ones who are laggards, like Germany, because Germany would prefer to keep deferring to the United States and getting guarantees from the US for its own defense, this eventually would have to be accepted. And it seems to me that if Europe does accept the US, let's say the Trumpian diktat on this matter, they would then, in return, keep the US as their military partner, which at this point seems an almost permanent feature, as I said before. So there is a definite contradiction in Macron's proposal, and that's why I think most European states will not follow him there.
Tom, I want to come to another point that you raised, which I think is particularly relevant. The question of what really happens to Europe's idea of defense at a time like this. If Russia, in fact, wins this war, and if, in fact, as you described, Ukraine becomes, in a sense, a smaller country, these questions of what kind of monies European countries need to spend for their defense? Will America, till kingdom come, be able to guarantee a security umbrella for Europe? All of these questions will really explode in many ways. Also, I also want to bring in the societal angle into this, Combe. We can see what's happening to American society. We can also see what's happening to several parts of Europe through, migration and immigration of various kinds, some legal, some illegal, some assimilated, a lot really very badly assimilated. These fissures, people think of society and security as two independent, sort of watertight bubbles, but we know that's not true. Talk to us a little bit about how these will collide if on one hand Russia wins, on another Trump wins, and then what happens?
First,
Because remember, if Trump wins, I'm sorry, I just want to make one more point. If Trump wins, the kind of battles that we are seeing play out, and which we saw play out in the first term of Trump, the same battles that have begun again on the on the war in Gaza and on Israel-Palestinian issues across American universities, this will actually explode at a much wider level if Trump wins. How relevant, in a sense, would be the idea of America really being able to ad infinitum guarantee security when its own society is going through such turmoil? And what happens to security in Europe when, societies within Europe are facing such fissures?
clearly, there is a potential for disintegration of Europe, and that's exactly what people like Macron and Draghi and several others have said in the last several months. I think, in my view, the position taken by Europe at the behest of the United States and the United Kingdom on Ukraine has been disastrously mistaken, because instead of making a deal to guarantee the neutrality of Ukraine as a buffer state, as is the case for other states like Sweden and Finland and Austria, instead of that, the Europeans committed themselves to ensuring the victory of Ukraine over Russia, which was an unrealistic objective. And they have gotten themselves enmeshed in an issue which, however you look at it, whether you like Ukraine or you don't like Ukraine and you don't like Zelensky, the fact is that Ukraine and Russia have been together politically and culturally for centuries. And that when the Soviet Union was broken up, which is not something that people talk about, they say, oh, yeah, but it was broken up and Ukraine became independent. Yes, but there was a structure above it all, which was the community of independent states. And these states were supposed to be together, just like, say, the European Union or NATO are together. Now, when the United States decided in wisdom from 2007 that Ukraine should become part of the Western Bloc, that was a clear violation of the original intent of the separation between the three states of the Soviet Union in the West, which were, of course, apart from the Baltic states, which had separated earlier, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. This was a direct provocation to Russia. And let's face it, what would NATO and the European Union do if, say, Poland or Hungary decided that they are going to strike an alliance with China and that China will position nuclear missiles on their soil and move some military units of the Chinese or People's Liberation Army? Naturally, that wouldn't work from the point of view of the West. Whether or not they would invade these countries, we don't know, but they would certainly find ways of blocking that move, that transition, which would actually be revolutionary. So you have to understand the context and why the Europeans were completely wrong, in my view, in deciding to make Ukraine an existential part of Europe. This is what Macron keeps saying, that if Ukraine falls, then all of Europe is challenged and probably NATO fails and the European Union may not survive. It may be true in the current situation because of the kind of hole that the Europeans have dug themselves into, more than the Americans, because the Americans can always pull out and say, well, we are another continent, but the Europeans cannot go anywhere. So now they have to claim that, we have somehow to defeat Russia because otherwise we are losing. And yet it's not true. I mean, Ukraine was not part of NATO, not part of the EU. Therefore, it was quite possible to establish a border, preferably with a neutral status. But they somehow refused that because of the American insistence that NATO should expand. And Macron reiterated in his speech that the European Union can keep expanding, that there are other states. Which ones they are? Well, obviously Georgia. And you are talking about a number of states which are on the border of Russia, which are former Soviet Union. We all know that there have been many attempts to destabilize Belarus, to bring it through a color revolution into the West. And so far it has failed because of the Belarusian president and also because of very strong Russian support for the current Belarusian government. But clearly the European and American intent is to expand and gradually surround Russia and diminish the Russian influence. And this is the root cause of the current war. So to answer your question, you are right. The United States is in a state of growing instability and very, very hard to heal divide between, you might say, the left and the right in its society. And in that sense, Europe is right to look at the possibility of being abandoned in some way by the Americans. Even if NATO remains as a skeleton, the US may simply not be able or willing to invest in it. So a European defense mechanism would be right. But that's where, from the beginning, we should have talked about the proposal that was made by Russia many times, which was a European and Eurasian common security architecture, which obviously would include Russia. Whereas now the talk that Macron and others give is always about how to create a bulwark and a fortress against Russia and China. which at the same time you need for economic and other reasons, and yet you want to essentially fight them. So, this is a very, very self-contradicting policy, which I don't think has a great future.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Combe, because I wanted to come to this point. On one hand, this bulwark supposedly is being built against Russia and China. On the other, Europe cannot but want Russian energy. It cannot but want to do business consistently with China. In fact, from the vantage point of India, sitting, for instance, say in New Delhi or perhaps Jakarta or somewhere else in Southeast Asia or South Asia, it might even seem that the Europeans are going all out in a sense to, apart from, of course, Meloni, who's walked out of BRI, in many ways are consistently laying out the red carpet to do more and more business with China. In fact, many would argue that they're not doing enough to counter China. This is a contradiction at the very heart of European geopolitics today, isn't it?
Indeed, especially Germany. As you know, Chancellor Scholz was in China recently, supposedly against the advice of his own foreign minister, who toes the American line as far as China is concerned. But the Germans, having lost most of Russian business, are fairly desperate to develop further trade with China. And yet they are also stealing a leaf from the American agenda, which is confront China and yet do business with them, which in a way, is one step forward and two steps backward. And that simply doesn't work with a state like China, which obviously is very powerful and has a lot to gain from exploiting European weakness and has really few incentives of pleasing the Europeans beyond the point. So this whole idea of saying, we don't like you and we think you are terrible as far as your domestic policies are concerned, and you are also very bad for international trade because of the way you exploit and circumvent the rules. This is what Macron was talking about also in his speech. And yet we want you to be partners and we like you and we just want you to change. But provided you change, we're happy to work with you, which is simply in the case of China doesn't work. And it hasn't worked in the case of Iran either. So there is a certain amount of self-delusion there. And I was particularly struck by the insistence that Macron put towards the end of his speech on the uniqueness of European values and how Europe has humanistic values, and these should be preserved, and the rest of the world is not like that, and that's why Europe is unique. There is a certain amount of narcissism there. Which is also, again, paradoxical because he has often said, sometimes he said that there was no such thing as French culture. But on the other hand, he's very convinced about the superiority of what he calls European culture. There are disputes about if there is a real common European culture. I mean, is there so much in common between Sweden and Greece? I don't know. The fact is that this kind of eulogizing of European uniqueness and European values is also intended to create a new European citizenship as opposed to the separate nationalities that exist within Europe. And we have seen Macron emphasizing that, saying we should learn to be Europeans, we should be trained and educated as Europeans. But then again, in practical terms, this will take a long time, assuming people accept it. And, if you look at the United States, there is a Senate and there is a House of Representatives. But all the people who sit in those two assemblies are naturally patriotic, supposedly, and they do not question the existence of the United States. What you have in the European Parliament is a very different phenomenon because you have a number of parties which are Eurosceptical and increasingly so, and their numbers tend to increase. So when you are talking about a project for Europe and you are dealing with institutions which are only partly convinced that your project is any good, you can hardly be speaking on behalf of everybody. What you are doing is representing a particular faction which has its own ideas and which tries to impose them on everybody else. And we know that there are places like Hungary, even Italy, that are not quite convinced about the whole thing. But then you had Macron say quite stunningly towards the end of his speech that, we are doing a project in spite of you. And he was saying in spite of you, which is European citizens. So, how credible is that when you are saying in the name of democracy that you are actually pushing, you are into an adventure? That's the word he used. Europe is an adventure which is being pursued in spite of you. In that case, you are really not sure you are getting the kind of support you need to achieve your goals.
This is fascinating, Com, especially because Europe faces China. As you were speaking, I was reminded that one of the great pillars of Xi Jinping's, efforts to change the world order is this great civilizational project, right? Because he believes China is a unique civilization and so on and so forth, right? It's almost that Europe, or at least a faction in Europe, wants to believe in this common European culture or even European civilization. But actually, there are many, many people, as you correctly pointed out, who don't believe that at all. You were talking about what's common between Sweden and Greece. I want to ask you, Com, if you were today sitting in Stockholm, or say if you were sitting in Malmo, could you even argue today, sitting in Malmo, that everybody in Malmo, which in recent past has seen bombs go off in one of the safest places in the world, do all people in Malmo also believe in Sweden? Forget everything else. Do all people in Malmo and Stockholm believe in Sweden in Europe? Those are fundamental questions on the streets of Paris, on the streets of Stockholm, on the streets of Berlin today. So considering this is a question, considering even until a few years ago, grave questions were being asked about, Holland and, places in Holland where the police even couldn't enter, and what, certain kinds of preachers were doing in the mosques of Holland. A lot of Europeans, and increasingly many quote unquote Europeans who've just come in, so to speak, that integration itself is deeply questionable and is fractured. So considering all of this, I mean, Macron sits in a city which saw those infamous riots. How can he make such claims knowing all of these things?
He did refer to the problems of integration of immigrants, and he was referring to the need to repatriate those who come illegally and who are not qualified to become citizens, or at least permanent residents. And of course, at the same time, he criticized the British policy of deporting people to Rwanda. He said you cannot do that. It's contrary to European values and to humanitarian notions. But you must also have a system to limit illegal immigration and to send people back, etc., etc. So this has been said for many years, but not very much has been done about it. The fact is that you are right. A lot of the relatively recent immigrants, but also even more so, the second or third generation people from other parts of the world, particularly North Africa and West Asia, who were born in Europe, France or Germany, many of them are not at all interested in the uniqueness of European values. They are there because they were born there or because they find it easier to live there. But they are also very often quite opposed and critical to some of the so-called European values. In fact, Macron again came back to the fact that among the things that Europe should guarantee constitutionally, which France has done recently, is the right to abortion. Now, that doesn't go very well with some of the cultures that have come into the country, except perhaps that it helps them because, well, their numbers rise, the numbers of the local people tend to shrink. So you are getting into a growing imbalance. And, I will only give you a very recent example that some nationalist leaders, so-called nationalist far right, if you want to call them that way, but not violent people, they were going to Brussels to address a rally. But the mayor of Brussels happened to be a Muslim. And he said, you are not allowed here because we don't like what you are talking about. Of course, that was eventually overturned by a tribunal in Belgium. But the fact is that you have now people who are in key positions. Just think of London. Just think of dozens and dozens of major cities in Europe, where you have mayors, officials, who come from other cultures and other religions and who are not willing to accept certain features of European identity, especially when it talks about nationalism, tradition, culture, Christianity. So what you have now is a leadership such as Macron represents, which is never talking about religion because they're completely secular. They reject any kind of spiritual heritage. They say we are only a culture, but we are basically what they call a humanistic culture, which means we don't have any particular religion. And they try to imagine, I mean, they claim that this will reconcile everybody. But we all know that this is not the case. And as you know, there are now these very nationalistic parties that are rising in some states. They are in power, who are basically rejecting this notion of multiculturality, that, you know, everybody should be happy together and it's all a matter of economic well-being, and don't get into differences in culture because they shouldn't exist. Well, they do exist. And Macron obviously refuses to acknowledge that. But, you know, there is a certain blindness to obvious facts, which comes from ideological convictions. For example, Macron was hard-pressed in the beginning of his talk to explain what really Europe had accomplished. He had to say that Europe was actually behind many of its goals and needed to make a much bigger effort to get there, including spending huge amounts of money on high-tech innovation, etc., where he said Europe is lagging behind. But what he also said among the achievements that he attributed to Europe was, well, you know, we were able to provide vaccines for everybody. And that was so good because we had European vaccines. Now, I'm sorry, but this is factually wrong. Europe bought 4 billion doses of vaccines from Pfizer, which is an American company, and a lot of vaccines from Moderna, which is another American company, and the only French company which was trying to develop a vaccine could never do it in time, that is Sanofi. So don't tell me that this was a European deal. In fact, this European deal has created a scandal, which is now reverberating in the European Parliament, because it turns out that these vaccines were not delivering what was promised. The prices were inflated. There were probably huge kickbacks that were paid to the European Commission, especially to Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen. So the whole thing stinks, and it's been raised in a number of major newspapers. And Macron keeps saying that this was a great success and Europe was able to develop its own vaccine strategy. And without Europe, this would never have happened. Excuse me, why do you need Europe to develop vaccines? If anyway, if you get vaccines from any other European country and if they have enough production, they can certainly sell them to you. So, you know, the whole thing is basically not logical. It is an attempt to persuade people that, you know, without Europe, we'd all be dead.
As we come towards the end of our conversation, Com, I would want you to reflect once again on what Macron said and compare it with the situation on the ground. I'm really glad you mentioned this vaccine question. It seems to me that this great values that Macron talks about and upon which Europeans claim that diplomacy is based because it's value-based, values-based, so to speak. Interestingly, you know, when the German chancellor goes to do business with China, there is no mention of values-based diplomacy there, ironically, right? Interestingly, when, you know, like you said, the Brussels mayor stops a peaceful protest march, there is no question of values there. So there are so many contradictions inbuilt in this entire values framework that one wonders where it's going to really end up. Let's talk even about the question of values in business. Europe claims that there are these great values in even in its trade, right? And that's why there are laws like the CBAM, for instance, right? The so-called green laws. But European negotiators, you know, accept that many of these things don't even work with China. So even there is a deep embedded contradiction. So I wonder, in conclusion, what you think about the future of, we've discussed the future of, you know, European security and society. What is the future of Europe's values-based diplomacy?
You know, it's a bit like the American values-based diplomacy. Not many people believe in it anymore because they all know that business in the end decides what gets done and what is not done. And the factor of morality and ethics and values are used politically to score points and to put other countries on the defensive. I'm sure there are times when indeed genuine values are defended, but this is not the general rule. If you look, for example, at what has happened recently about two conflicts, the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the conflict in Israel-Palestine, you will notice that the positions taken by European states are completely different and very often at variance with the positions, or at least the beliefs, of a very large part of their populations. With regard to Israel-Palestine, basically governments have cracked down on anybody who criticized and attacked Israel. In France, some people, even parliamentarians, are being sued and tried for making statements that were considering overly critical of Israel, accusing Israel of genocide. Well, you know, it's in the International Court of Justice, so it's not exactly as if you are making a revolutionary terroristic statement. But very harsh punishment is being meted sometimes to people who have this belief. On the other hand, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, there are not two ways about it. You have to be totally against Russia and completely supportive of Ukraine, and any criticism of Ukraine is regarded as suspicious because it means you are probably an agent of the Kremlin. So, you know, this shows you the duplicity and the dishonesty of a lot of this. And I think people are awakening to it everywhere. And of course, if I might say, this puts not only China, but even India on a stronger footing, because both of them say, you know, look at yourself in the mirror before you go after our flaws and our shortcomings. And this is what probably eventually will lead to a reassessment and a return to realism, because let's face it, in foreign policy and even domestic policy, realism in the end always wins. You cannot claim to be an idealist and impose your views on others simply because you take the moral high ground without justification.
Final word then, Kom, because you mentioned India. You know, in India's watching with great interest. India got a lot of flack when the Ukraine war began. But as the war has dragged on and on, India sitting in New Delhi, many of us are watching, you know, you're in New Delhi too these days. We are watching with bemusement, should I say, on how, you know, moods and opinions around the world, especially in the West and indeed in Europe, are changing about the Ukraine war. I'm glad you mentioned the war in Gaza, because that's another critical fault line that seems to be getting imported in a sense from the US, from the UK into mainland Europe. Final word, how do you see these two things pan out?
That's the hardest thing to predict. My feeling is that whatever happens in the specific case of the Gaza conflict, the situation of Israel has been definitely weakened in the region, in its region. And as a result, there will be much lower levels of support from Europe and even from the US. As you know, there is now a well-founded rumor that Iran will declare itself a nuclear power within a few months. That will contribute to restoring, if you might say so, the balance of power, which was until now heavily tilted in favor of Israel. And you have seen the latest Iranian bombing, which has been more successful, even though it was meant more as a demonstration, but it has been more successful than was initially acknowledged. This is not taking sides, it is just observing the facts. Therefore, on the one hand, you will have a much weaker Israel and a much stronger hand given to some of the Middle Eastern powers. On the other hand, with regard to Ukraine, this is a very dangerous situation, because if the West keeps trying to hit Russia through the Ukrainian forces by hitting deep inside Russia with more and more powerful missiles, which seems to be the intent at this point, then Russia might be led to strike even harder, not only Ukraine, but surrounding states. And that would lead to a possible conflagration. So we just have to hope that everybody is scared enough of this that they avoid it. And I think the situation will remain very, very tense until the next election in the United States, simply because Biden doesn't want to be seen as losing. And so he will try to keep the war burning without getting too much into it, but not let it settle down, because that would look like a Russian defeat. And again, I will remind you of what Macron said again in his speech. He said, Russia cannot be allowed to win. What does that mean? It means that you'll fight it till there are no Ukrainians left, because you basically don't want to send your own people, even though he sent a trial balloon saying we might send some French soldiers. And of course, there was a real outcry in France saying, what the hell are you talking about? Are you crazy? So he probably sort of not slightly stepped back saying, all right, well, this is just an option. But the fact is that he doesn't have a clue how to get out of this. Either he somehow has to eat his words and say, well, we have to settle with Russia in some way, or he has to go into an actual war. And I don't think France or any European country is ready for it.
In all of this, Coom, of course, China is watching all of this very, very carefully. We know, of course, that you know, Chinese nefarious work in the South China Sea is increasing. As China watches with great glee, I'm sure, societies and regions within the United States and indeed Europe go into turmoil. The Chinese obviously are hoping to have an upper hand.
I think countries like Russia and China and Iran, as different as they may be, and as grave their own internal troubles may be in some cases, they still present a picture of stability. I'm not judging the merits of it, but as regard to European and American polities, you see that there is a tremendous self-doubt, which Macron evoked also, saying that he felt the Europeans had lost faith in their own capabilities and in their own future. And that is expressed through enormous turmoil. You know, the challenge to the very institutions of the state, and not to mention the personalities who lead that state. So that's a common situation mostly in the West now. Whereas in the East, because of the economic hope and the development that is taking place, there is a great deal of stability, and this is probably what will give certain countries of Asia the ability, the chance to get to the point where, let's say, the Westerners have been for the last 300 years, you know, which is a position of hegemony. I'm not saying that Asia will become hegemonic, but they will certainly enjoy a privileged position in terms of capital, in terms of ability to take up and perhaps solve global issues, which the West seems to have lost.
Come Carpentier Gourdon, we leave it at that. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk us through Macron's big speech. 3 more years for him in France, and you know the future of Europe, in a sense, as you explained in great detail, hangs in balance as America goes into a big definitive election. Thank you, Com, for explaining all this to us.
Most welcome. Thank you, Hindol. All the best.